Hey everybody, today we continue on the last week of the earthly life of Jesus. We come to Thursday, and today we're going to discover that Thursday is filled with a lot of surprises. I chose the word surprise, but some of them were more like bombshells or real gut punches, and I'm sure that after some of them the disciples wished Jesus would have said April Fools, because we just had April Fools a couple of Fridays ago. Now it's Thursday, it's 1 day, T-minus 1 day until the crucifixion, and T-minus 3 days until the resurrection. So far in our series, we've seen Jesus entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on the back of a donkey, greeted with songs of praise from the Passover crowds as he was entering Jerusalem. On Monday, Jesus came into Jerusalem, cursed the fig tree, cleansed the temple. Tuesday, Jesus taught on many subjects, he answered many questions, and he was trying to open all of these closed hearts and minds. On Wednesday, yesterday I just gave an example of a real extravagant giver and just a ruthless taker. So fasten your seatbelts, because I'm going to go really quickly today. We're going to move real fast because we've got so much to explore on that Thursday. You know, that Thursday in the last week of Jesus' earthly life was the first day of the week-long Jewish festival, or feast I should say, called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. At some point during that Thursday, Jesus' disciples asked Jesus where he wanted them to make preparations for Jesus to eat the Passover. Let me read from Mark 14:12-16. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." The disciples left, went into the city, and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. Now, notice that Jesus had made previous arrangements for the Passover in the upper room, just as I believe he had made arrangement for the donkey used for his Palm Sunday triumphal entry. Mark and Luke point out that the man carrying the jar of water would meet them, and then they would follow him to the house, and the owner of the house would show them that room that was all ready for them to use for the supper. Luke tells us that the disciples who were sent on this mission were Peter and John in Luke 22:7. Some scholars believe that the home where this took place was the family home of John Mark, the man who would become a missionary partner of Paul, the author of the Gospel of Mark, who we've been spending a lot of time in this little series we're doing. So Mark continues in Mark 14:17. When evening came, he arrived with the 12. Now, Matthew and Luke, they point out that Jesus reclined at the table with his apostles. They were there to participate in the traditional Passover meal. This was a meal that the Jews had been celebrating ever since the Exodus from Egypt, 1,500 years of celebrating. Jesus and his disciples, they gathered around the table according to the cultural practice of the day. Most famous picture that we see of the Last Supper is Leonardo da Vinci around 1495, and in many respects it doesn't do us any favours of what the Last Supper actually is. It shows Jesus in the middle and all the other disciples next to him. Great painting, don't get me wrong, but it's not the way it happened. I want to explain this a little bit. The traditional Jewish table was about 15 to 18 inches tall, so it's not very tall. Our tables, they're probably, 28 to 30 inches. I don't know if there's any builders out there. And now the table would have been surrounded by cushions, and the guests again would have reclined. The host of the dinner would occupy the second from the end of the left. The youngest person present would occupy the position immediately to the right of the host. He needed to be close to the host to ask the traditional questions during the ceremony. Okay, you get that? The chief guest would be seated to the host's left. After the chief guest, the other people who'd occupy the remaining position going from the chief guest's left in order of importance all the way around the table. The person of least importance would be at the furthest seat around the table, so somewhere right in the corner. Jesus was a host. John was the youngest. So he was to Jesus' right, and the biblical record shows Judas was seated in the chief position. Peter was in the lowest position. Judas was perhaps the only one presumptuous enough to take the chief seat. Luke tells us that during the meal, a dispute arose about which of them was the greatest, which led to Jesus saying, if you've got your Bibles again, swing with me to Luke 22, 26 to 28. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials. So you understanding the context. Now, John, the Gospel of John also tells us that Jesus gave a surprise demonstration of that very truth. John 13, 2-5. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into the basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. Now, washing the feet of guests in the Jewish home, it's a common custom in Jesus' day. You probably heard this all of your Christian life, all your Christian career, really common. It was needed for hygiene, of course, but it was also a means of showing hospitality and honour. The task was already performed by one of the household servants, never by the master. So it was really shocking that Jesus, their teacher and their Messiah, was the one to take the place of the servant and be the one who would wash their dirty feet. I want to give you a bit of a modern day illustration about this. Imagine you were invited to dine with Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, or maybe invited to a dinner at some celebrity's house. Then beyond just being surprised by that invitation, imagine that when you arrive for dinner, the Prime Minister or the celebrity meets you at the door wearing a cook's apron. They sit you in the living room, then they begin serving you the hors d'oeuvres. How comfortable would you be if you were served by someone so famous or so important? Maybe that helps us imagine how uncomfortable the apostles must have felt when Jesus began to wash their feet, and perhaps that's why Peter reacted the way Peter reacted, like as the way Peter normally reacts when Jesus came to wash Peter's feet. This is what Peter declared: "You will never wash my feet. You will never wash my feet." And Jesus replied, "Oh, but if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me." Now, the idea of being disowned by Jesus was even more uncomfortable to Peter than having Jesus wash his feet. So he went to the opposite extreme and he said, "Then wash my whole body." And Jesus said that washing wasn't necessary, and Jesus proceeded to wash Peter's feet and all the apostles' feet, including Judas, the man who had already agreed to betray him. And Jesus knew it. So Jesus went on to teach. He began to teach them about following his example by lovingly serving others, or by lovingly serving each other. But washing their feet wasn't the only surprising thing that Jesus did at that meal. Jesus announced to them when he suddenly announced in John 13, 18 to 21, "I am not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen. But this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. Very truly I tell you, Whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me." After he said this, Jesus was troubled in the spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." All the disciples would have been shocked and looked at each other, wide-eyed, disbelief, thinking, what on earth is going on? Wasn't really obvious to them who the betrayer would be. They'd been with Jesus for 3 years, so it's not obvious at all. Peter motioned to John, who was next to Jesus, to ask Jesus who the betrayer was, and Jesus announced, "He's the one I give the piece of bread to after I've dipped it." And Jesus dipped the bread and he gave it to Judas. Now, John 13:27, John reports that after Judas ate the bread, Satan entered him and Jesus told him, "What you are doing, do quickly." So we have here Judas leaving immediately, but the other apostles didn't really understand what was happening. And this must have been really unsettling to them. What was happening? Is Jesus joking here? Is it April Fool's? What on earth's going? So after Judas left, Jesus proceeded with the rest of the Passover meal. And during the traditional Passover meal, there were several times in the meal when the bread was broken, and there was about 4 times when they drank from the cup of wine. So Jesus likely instituted the Lord's Supper, the communion here, when the bread was broken just before the 3rd cup. And we know so well the bread represents the body of Jesus. The fruit of the vine represents his blood. His body and his blood would be given out on the cross in a matter of a few hours, but they surely didn't grasp that reality at that particular point. The Passover, the celebration concluded with the 4th cup of wine, after which they sang some of Psalm 115 through to 118. Matthew and Mark actually tell us that they went out and sung a hymn, and they went to the Mount of Olives. Now, it appears that as they made their way out of the city, across the Kidron Valley up to the Mount of Olives, that Jesus taught them along the way. John gives us 3 chapters of Jesus' teaching during that journey in chapter 14 to chapter 16. John also shares a beautiful Jesus prayer in John 17 where he prays for himself, he prays for those disciples, and then he prays for us, all those who believe through their testimony. At some point in the journey to the Garden of Gethsemane, on the Mount of Olives, Jesus makes this surprising statement, Matthew 26:31. Then Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." Can you imagine their reaction? Are you kidding? Just like always, the impetuous, tough guy Peter speaks up. "Even if ever any one of them falls away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus replied, this is where he says, "Truly I tell you tonight, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter's continuing even stronger. He says, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you." And all the disciples said the same thing, Matthew 26:35. In Luke's account, Jesus also said in Luke 22:31 to 32, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." The gut punches must have hit hard. Judas would betray him, Peter would deny him, and all of them would desert him. That really can't be, can it? Then they arrived at the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem. Across the Kidron Valley lay the Mount of Olives, which had been a favourite place for Jesus to visit when he was in and around the city. It took about 30 minutes to get to the Mount of Olives from the southwestern section of Jerusalem, where the upper room was located. It was on this mountain earlier in the week that Jesus had told the disciples about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the signs to look for in order to flee the city. It was from this mountain that some 40 days later that Jesus would ascend to heaven. The Garden of Gethsemane, I want to talk about that for a minute, was a private garden filled with olive trees owned by a merchant in the olive business. May have been sympathetic or may have been a disciple, at least sympathetic towards Jesus. Today, in Israel, 4 sites compete for the distinction of the Royal Garden of Gethsemane, and all are in virtually the same area, so there's little doubt about the general location of the garden. Not that I've ever been to Jerusalem. So from its vantage point, about halfway up the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane had a clear view across the Kidron Valley to the city of Jerusalem. It would be impossible for anyone to leave the city and cross the valley without being seen from the garden, especially at night. And you've got to think if they carried lighted torches like Judas and the mob did. Now, as midnight drew near, Jesus came here with 11 of the apostles to wait for the arrival of Judas along with the mob who'd arrest him. While they had been in the upper room and while they had made their way to the garden, Jesus had prepared his disciples for the drama that was about to take place. The cross was now only about 9 hours away, and Satan's going to have his moment of victory. And Jesus knew how difficult this would be for his disciples. So he told them that Judas would betray him, Peter would deny him, and all of them would desert him. But they couldn't imagine any of these things taking place. So here in the garden, Jesus chose to wait for the inevitable. He turned to his Father in prayer. Luke tells us when they arrived at the garden, Jesus told his disciples to, this is what he said in Luke 22:39-41. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and he prayed. Now, Mark's version includes a few more details, Mark 14:32-36. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply disturbed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little further, he fell to the ground, and he prayed that if it is possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." 8 apostles stayed in one place while Peter, James, and John went with Jesus to another place. Jesus revealed his heart to his inner 3 apostles, and he gave them more instructions. Peter, James, and John had never seen this powerful leader, this Jesus, in such a vulnerable state. The real human side of Jesus was on display here. Scripture tells us that Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are tempted, but he was without sin in Hebrews 4:15. It wasn't Jesus being God that sustained him through this agony, but it was his confidence and trust in his Father, in God, here in the garden. Only hours before his death, Jesus gave us a perfect example of turning to God to supply that which is lacking in one's own strength and in our ability. Jesus asked his Father to take this cup away, if possible, but wanted God's will to be done. This cup that Jesus referred to was his death on the cross. Now, it's obvious that Jesus didn't want to go to the cross. He didn't want to go to the cross. But he did so for a few reasons. First, it was God's will, and that alone would have been more than enough. But Jesus had a second reason. He told his disciples just a few minutes earlier in John 15:13, he said, "Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." His love for us is what also led Jesus to the cross. Twice we are told that Jesus came back to where Peter, James, and John were supposed to be keeping watch with him in prayer, but he found them sleeping, and this is what it says in Mark 14:37-40. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you sleeping? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Once more he went away and he prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. I'm sure Jesus wasn't surprised to find them sleeping, but it must have really hurt him nonetheless. I feel sorry for these guys. It's pretty late at night, and once I did a little bit more study and realised that they drank 4 cups of wine, that would have taken their toll on them. Luke is the only gospel writer who mentions that an angel from heaven appeared to Jesus and he strengthened them in Luke 22:43. How cool is that? Wouldn't you have liked to have been there? Wouldn't you have loved to see this angel come? Luke also tells us that Jesus prayed so fervently and with such anguish that sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground in Luke 22:44. I want to continue with Mark 14:41-47. Returning the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared with him. With him was a crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. One of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Of all 4 of the Gospels record Peter pulling his sword and swinging it, likely probably aiming for the man's neck, but thankfully he hit the man's ear and it came off. The man is identified as Malchus, the high priest's servant. Luke, the doctor, he said that Jesus said, "No more of this," and touching the man's ear, he healed him in Luke 22:51. Do you think Malchus became a believer of Jesus straight after that episode? Jesus told Peter to put down the sword because those who take up the sword are going to perish by the sword. Then Jesus said if he wanted to, he could call on his Father and his Father would send more than 12 legions of angels. But then how would the scriptures be fulfilled in Matthew 26:52-54? The Gospel of John includes interesting interplay prior to Peter taking out his sword. John 18:3-9. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. He asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then look, let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." When Jesus asked, "Who do you want?" He's not seeking any information here. He knew full well who they wanted. Rather, what he was doing was establishing whom they were going to get. Jesus' power over the soldiers was like the power of Obi-Wan Kenobi. If you've ever seen that used over the stormtroopers when he said, "These are not the droids you are looking for." One wonders why Jesus' words, "I am he," caused those with Judas, those strong, those well-trained soldiers to fall face down on the ground. I really believe God's identity carries power. Jesus repeated the question while they were on the ground and replied the same way, but then he added that they had to let the other men, his disciples, go. So having established who was in control of that particular moment, Jesus established the ground rules under which he would go with them. He would go with them if they would let the other apostles, the others go. Let me mention one more thing about this betrayal. How ruthless was a kiss of a betrayer. Jesus was a pretty well-known person, pretty well-known guy, And I think he would have been recognised by a lot of people, at least within that crowd who came there that night. And there were so many other ways that Judas could have identified which one was Jesus, but Judas chose the most intimate of gestures, a kiss to mark the condemned one. He knew it was coming, and he asked Judas, "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" I like the fact that Jesus pointed out what Judas was doing and what Judas was responsible for. Mark concludes the garden story with these words in Mark 14:50-52. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Jesus was left alone with his captors in the garden. All the disciples fled, as he said they would. Mark is the only gospel writer who mentions a young man who ran away naked. And many people believe that that young man was actually John Mark himself, the writer of the gospel. It's theorized that when Judas and his mob searched for Jesus, perhaps they went to the home where the upper room was, thinking that Jesus might still be there. If the home in the upper room was where Mark lived, perhaps when the mob left, Mark ran to the garden to warn Jesus. Perhaps when the soldiers tried to grab him, apprehend him, they grabbed him by his linen cloth breeches, and Mark slipped down and he ran away naked, leaving it in their hands. Next time you play Bible trivia, you'll know the answer to who in the Bible was a streaker. I wish we had more time to discuss the lessons we've learned today, but I just want to discuss 4 to finish up with. First one, Jesus is the one who serves, and we are served by the best. Whenever we partake in the Lord's Supper, every time we have communion, remember that we are invited to sit at God's table. Remember that. And we are served by the King of Kings himself. Our Jesus is a host. He's not the guest. He is the one who serves, not the one served. When the bread is broken, Jesus breaks it. And when the wine is poured, Jesus pours it. And when we're washed of our uncleanliness, it's because Jesus put on an apron. Remember this, just as a warm-up for what will happen in heaven. Secondly, Jesus prayed for us on that last night before his crucifixion. And he now sits at the right hand of God interceding for us, Romans 8:34. What a wonderful thought that is. Jesus prayed for Peter when Satan wanted to sift him up like wheat. Jesus prayed for those disciples. And he prayed for all of us who would later believe in him. Jesus is our eternal high priest who lives to intercede for us. Third thing, Jesus understands how it feels to be betrayed. Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. All the disciples abandoned him. Peter denied him. The religious leaders hated him. The crowds turned on him. Jesus understands when you and I are betrayed by the people closest to us. Loving people is messy. Life isn't fair, and Jesus never promised us that it would be. He never promised us a rose garden. Jesus didn't look for fairness on earth. Rather, he kept his eyes on God. Kept his eyes on God's future, his future justice and promise. So while going through a literal hell on earth, Jesus kept his eyes on heaven. Let's keep our mind that way when things of the earth turn against us. I want you to remember that heaven turns to us. Finally, Jesus was in control. Satan, Judas, a mob of religious leaders, soldiers, they're not in control. Jesus had predicted all of this would happen on that Thursday and Friday. But he also knew what was coming on Sunday. It looked like Satan and evil had won, but God and good always win. It may look like Satan is having his own way, but remember, Sunday is coming. God is in control. God's plans can't be stopped. I'm doing a sermon on Saturday called Sunday's Coming. It's inspired by Max Lucado, a couple of sermons I saw about. It was Friday, but Sunday's coming, so it's going to be Saturday, but Sunday's coming. Hey, bless you. I'll talk to you more on Good Friday tomorrow. See ya.